Greetings, everyone, to our Swedenborgian Community Online final discussion about the universe and I, where science and spirituality meet. It's been quite the journey so far, an amazing book, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Pretty short, 100 pages long. If you haven't read it, recommend it. These conversations have, for me, been really illuminating in terms of the meaning of this book, and I love what George Dole's done, integrating modern pop culture physics, if you can call any type of physics that, with spirituality, and seeing where they meet, where they might connect, and where physics actually has been illuminating certain ideas in pop culture and in science, and we haven't really been aware of how deep those physicists have gone. So thank you for joining us in our final one, and I appreciate you all connecting with us this evening. So we'll just get into it, and we're on chapter 6, the God question. And here I think, he feels the end coming, and he's not pulling as many punches in terms of his spirituality, although I don't know if he has at all so far. And I'll just read the beginning here. He says, this chapter above all must be understood in the context of the Swedenborgian concept of appearances of truth, which from a scientific point of view can be thought of as model-dependent realism. We've talked about this quite a bit so far. This is pretty well covered in earlier videos. He says, my experience of walking face first into a plate glass wall, dating back to about 1950, remains my textbook example of the fact that it is possible to be at one and the same time quite certain and quite wrong about some particular thing. And I extend this fact to a belief that if there's no necessary correlation between certainty and truth, then the quest for either is likely to lead away from the other. Yeah, so I think this is a really important point in our world today, that you can be really certain about something, but if you're not really interested in the truth, then it can be really destructive, and it may not have any correlation with what's actually going on. I think all of us perceive that in some way around us, whether it's a projection of ourselves or the truth. That's something for us to interrogate. In fact, I think that's a call to us to say, okay, is my model, is my appearance of truth what I think? Is it actually based on reality? Is my perception clear, and how can I make it clear? Because there's always room to grow, as I know George Dole covers in these chapters. And then, so he moves on to this definition of God, and this is, for him, where to start in terms of a theological point of view. And he says it's good to, accept that God, from his point of view, is a creator and ruler of the universe, regarded as eternal, infinite, all-powerful, and all-knowing. And then he says this word infinite seems to have more to do with not knowing the limit, or being so infinite that it's like mysterious. You can almost replace the word infinite with transcending all bounds that we know and always will. And yet I think George Dole would say that you could have some idea of God, although he says God is indefinable. I find that kind of interesting, because his whole book is about language, and he's saying, well, God is indefinable. But in reality, all words kind of have a metaphorical intent and a definition that is seated in a person. And even when you define someone else, like they're angry, you're not really putting limits on their anger. You may not even know most of the nuances of it. You're just kind of highlighting this term that we've all agreed corresponds to a certain behavior. So in a way, you could still define God as infinite, or as loving, knowing, or at least perceiving or believing that God is loving versus evil. And of course, that depends on the person. So I find this kind of exploration of his interesting. And he says, I have already offered my opinion that the atheists and anti-theists are quite right in their insistence on the inadequacy of commonly held concepts of God. But I believe they are seriously wrong if they hold these concepts to be anything more than models of reality. And I think that's a big point today, that atheists, and as he puts it, anti-theists, are really often tackling certain ideas of God that are just inadequate. I think the problem sometimes occurs when they say, well, this is what all Christians think. And of course, me stereotyping atheists is not helpful either. But I think often we pretend like this very shallow version of a person exists, and we talk about everyone within a field that way. And I think for anyone, we need to think deeper about other people, especially people that hold a view that we find ridiculous, because often maybe we do think that there's only this shallow version of that kind of person, and so we describe all Christians the same way, when in fact there are so many varieties of all types of people that nothing's so simple. And then jumping further ahead, he says, the word infinite tells me that I should at least try to think in meta terms. That's a popular phrase nowadays, meta. Kaufman is on common ground with Einstein in his capacity for all. He proposes, quote, a worldview beyond reductionism, in which we are members of a universe of ceaseless creativity, in which life, agency, meaning, value, consciousness, and the full richness of human action have emerged. And I think this move away from reductionism, I guess, is what we were just talking about, in a sense, that we start to really value these deeper elements, this emergent humanity, meaning, agency in the world around us. And I think that's a good thing for all of us to lean into. On the next page, he says, a less obvious place to start is with ourselves, with how we have come to understand the presentation of reality. Based on the quantum principle that particles form only when they are observed, we must infer an observer of some sort for the inexplicable emergence of the first particles. Now I will, and I know he talks about this quite a bit on the next couple of pages, but I want to kind of tackle this idea that observation makes reality. And this is a concept usually cited from physics, pointing to Schrodinger's cat example or thought experiment when it comes to how quantum physics works. But I disagree with the idea that observation makes any definable physical interaction or physics, because I think it's true in a sense that God's observation does, but the experiment, Schrodinger's cat, doesn't actually describe that. In fact, quantum physics doesn't actually say an observation has to occur for an interaction to occur. It just says an interaction has to occur for a wave to solidify into a particle. We called it observations because in our experiments, the interaction was the tools we were using to measure whether or not these particles went through two doorways. So we said, well, when we put tools there that interact with these particles, they're definable and they behave differently than when we don't. And so we said, well, these observations made them solidify. But in fact, you could put the tools there and no person on the other end, and they would still solidify into those interactions. Trees really do fall down and make noise, even if nothing else living is around to hear it. So extrapolating that thought experiment and that idea to, okay, so there has to be this superconscious, or human beings have to be aware of it for it to solidify, I actually think is a misapplication, misinterpretation of physics. If you disagree, let me know what you think, and let's do some historical searching on where that idea came from. I've been surprised at its source. So he goes on to say, this argument is pursued with some rigor at the close of George Greenstein's elegant The Symbiotic Universe, Life and Mind in the Cosmos. While Greenstein is unwilling to, quote, accept the notion that it was God himself who so carefully crafted the cosmos, he also states that, quote, it is the observation itself that brings the physical world into existence, and that, quote, only a conscious mind is capable of performing such an observation. Again, I have personal interpretation issues with that. You may not. I'll keep going. If so, then given the omnipresence of particles in the universe, we must endow our observer with the characteristics of omnipresence and omniconsciousness. Okay, so he's taking this idea made popular through Schrodinger's cat to say, okay, well, if we have all this interaction from the beginning, and there has to be an observer on every single interaction, then we must have like a super observer, at least this all-pervasive observational quality. Could this be the type of God that Kaufman is looking for? George Dole says, the, quote, fully natural God who is the very creativity in the universe. Clearly, George is going to run with this. Let's do the same. This suggests that Deakin's frequent association of life and mind needs much closer attention than I have given it. If conscious mind was present that early, perhaps our search of the universe for signs of intelligent life is too limited, too parochial. Perhaps life has been present far, far earlier than we had thought, and we simply have not realized what it looks like. If, quote, only a conscious mind is capable of performing such an observation, unquote, of what we take to be physical reality, then mind has also been present in some, quote, obscure and primordial way. And it may indeed be that we now identify as mind is no more than a prelude to mind that is yet to come forth. So, mind being, in his indication, something beyond what we would define as mind has been around since the beginning because all things need to be observed. Greetings to the folks in the chat. Thanks for joining us for our final chat on the universe and I, where science and spirituality meet. I'm curious what you all think of this book so far, if you're willing to share. Is this the type of book we want to delve in further in the future? I'm planning on choosing a book by Emanuel Swedenborg, the unintentional namesake of this church, this denomination at large, to discuss next month. Is there a Swedenborgian book, a book by Swedenborg that you'd like to talk about? I may do a 101 course, who knows? It kind of depends on the feedback I get and on reflection, what speaks to me and the community. So let me know what you think, and we'll take that on next week. It should be fun looking at Swedenborg directly instead of through a beautiful mind like George Dole. So further down he says, I am right there with Kaufman when he writes, I believe we need a domain for our lives as wide as reality. If half of us believe in a supernatural God, science will not disprove that belief. We need a place for our spirituality, and a creator God is one such place. George Dole says, I am no longer with him, though, when he continues, I hold that it is we who have invented God to serve as our most powerful symbol. It is our choice how wisely to use our own symbol to orient our lives and our civilizations. I believe we can reinvent the sacred. We can invent a global ethic in a shared space safe to all of us, with one view of God as the natural creativity in the universe. This may well be no more than a matter of wording, but for me, George Dole, careful thought calls for careful wording. We do not invent God. We can be said to invent our models of God, and those models can and should be evaluated. They should grow as we learn. Childish models are not only appropriate for children, they are necessary. If childhood models of God are truly appropriate, they serve as foundations for the ones we adopt as we learn how to be more fully human. So the foundations for understanding quantum mechanics need to be laid in kindergarten or even preschool, perhaps with hide and seek games. I think that's an interesting idea, that not only reevaluating our religious ideas or scientific ideas and how we describe them, maybe looking a little bit harder at the terms we use and how we define these things, but also teaching these things earlier. So integrating quantum physics at an early age could involve games and insightful setups to help our kids and each other understand the universe better. You know, not necessarily getting into the weeds, but I think actually as we learn more about science and these broader ways that things tend to work, I think it becomes more applicable to use games and metaphors and stories to describe it, because how else do you describe spooky action at a distance that, like Einstein described quantum physics, without metaphors? to get other people to understand things, we use metaphors. And in a way, even equations are metaphors for different dynamic qualities in creation. Describing even a certain amount of energy with a number is a type of metaphor. So I think it's kind of interesting that maybe at the end of the day we tell each other stories and we can learn really deep things at an early age, I think pretty effectively if we tried. Further, he says, I welcome Kaufman's call for a wider domain for our lives. And I would bring attention to such similar metaphorical phrases as areas of concern and fields of study, as Kaufman puts it. I found myself both, quote, at home in Swedenborgian theology and lost in higher mathematics. Swedenborg explored the domain of the sacred with exemplary intelligence and integrity. He found it to be coherent and eminently practical, and he worked ceaselessly to communicate what he had discovered, but of course these are only metaphors. That's why he was quoting those words earlier, is because physicists tend to describe these things in metaphors when they talk about them. We think of things as exact science, but as something that I saw recently put it, science isn't an exact science. You know, our deepest, most successful theories that we've verified in labs have probabilities to them, they have descriptorial qualities to them. And so leaning into our models and basing it more and more on reality and getting insight maybe from different fields of study is actually a really healthy thing in our own lives and in every endeavor that we encounter. Yeah, good evening to you too, Albert. Yeah, what are some exciting and fun ways to describe some of these spiritual ideas? I'm curious what you all think in terms of relating maybe science and spirituality and future activities, in person, not in person. Is there some connection between these things and music? You know, music is very definable in certain ways, and yet when you really get into what is music, of course, then you get into physics and waves and, you know, all these things. So even though we can describe it very literally in a sense, that literalism only translates to something real and beautiful and harmonic when it transcends its literal defining equations and metaphors. So further, George Dole says, very simply, I hold to a model in which an awe-inspiring creativity has shown itself to be not random or lawless, but inherently principled, pressing constantly in one discernible direction at all times and all scales, and on all scales. Darwin envisioned natural selection as, quote, daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world the slightest variations, unquote. The theological names for such a phenomenon are omnipresence and omniscience, George Dole says. The biosphere, quote, remains a coherent whole even as it diversifies, unquote, because creativity is always and everywhere differentiating and integrating. We can invent all the ethical systems we choose, he says, but if they do not foster societal differentiation and integration, they will prove self-destructive. According to my model, Wilson's eusociality works not because we have done such a good job of inventing it, but because it is in accord with the creativity in the universe. The domain of values is a spiritual domain, and it is indeed awesome. It is outright beautiful, stunning. We're on page 84, if you're following in this copy. I think there's a lot of really insightful things here where he's kind of pulling together different concepts. But what I really appreciate is this talk of values and this kind of illuminating the idea that maybe human values, like what our motivations are about and what we're about in the world, should take some scrutinizing, yes, as we know in modern culture and pop society. There's a lot of evil in the world and a lot of misbehaving, but also not a lot of reformation and trying to heal those who are behaving that way, or even healing those who are hurt and victims, or our society's full of people being hurt deeply because of the way our society is structured and how we're using our resources and incentives. And I think leaning into health on all those ways, maybe even thinking of victimizers as victims in some way, maybe it's actually literally in their lives, but maybe in just a spiritual way, because each of us are put down and oppressed by those evil spiritual motives in our lives, those destructive, selfish modalities that we breathe into, we accept sometimes. In a spiritual view, as Swedenborg would put, we're actually being oppressed and enslaved in certain instances, in certain occasions, when we behave from those selfish motivations. We're enslaved by those selfish motivations, by evil spirits, which are just other people who are dead, or aliens who are dead, who continue to love those things. They think they're totally free in it, but in fact they're limited. They're not in freedom, because true freedom comes in love. Freedom itself is, as a quality, is seated in deep love for the other, deep love for the reality around us, and wisdom. And so to the extent we work against that, as he puts it, emergent and differentiating creativity of the universe, the more we actually enslave ourselves and are enslaved by those motives. Let's see what is being said in the comments. Alyssa's uplifting this idea that, or her feeling that she loves trying to find fun and creative ways to explain hard things. Yes, it's pretty cool if you can come up with insightful and creative ways to explain things. As you know, working with children, I'm sure you're probably better at it than I am. And yeah, Albert says that's good for working with children, I guess. Yeah, and working with each other, because often we have different insights, different points of view, and if we have some patience with each other, try to put things in creative and new light, new ways, maybe we can really share what we're thinking and hoping to share, and also not get defensive about it, because maybe it becomes more playful, and we realize that these insights, the metaphorical quality of how I'm explaining this, the universe itself, is from divinity, and I can't just own it. I can't get upset because someone disagrees with my thinking, because I'm not my thinking, I'm not my intelligence. These things are gifts, and if I become defensive against them, then I'm turning towards selfishness. I'm turning towards myself as kind of a supreme reality and a cornerstone of reality. So moving on, Reverend Dr. James or George Dole says James W. Fowler's Stages of Faith, building on the work of Paget, Kohlberg, and Erickson, I could be saying those names wrong, proposes 6 stages as logically and empirically sequential and invariant, moving in the direction of greater internal differentiation, complexity, flexibility, and stability. Because each stage incorporates and builds on the structure of the previous stages, integrating them into a more comprehensive and versatile new stage. Yeah, talking about that whole cascading reality that leads to more and more beautiful things in this universe. This could quite effortlessly be translated into a description of the evolution of the cosmos, George says. While Fowler's recognition of the functions of differentiation and integration shows indebtedness to Paget in particular, it should be noted that his book relies heavily on the solid empirical grounds of an extensive series of interviews of individuals of all relevant ages. Kaufman takes what is to me a major step in the right direction with the statements that agency and value bring with them what philosophers call teleological language, that is, language involving a sense of purpose or end, as in our common explanations for our actions based on our reasons and intentions, and that agency is emergent and real but not reducible to physics. This adds the final touch to Greenstein's conscious observer, making the metahuman metaphor virtually inescapable. Yeah, so George is just highlighting that in physics, often physicists describe creation in these metahuman ways, and they can't seem to help it. And then they even go really deep with this type of language that indicates end and agency in creation, as many of us do when we say the universe means this or is doing this. It seems like it's pretty popular in physics. And I forgot to mention earlier in the subnotes to something you said earlier, he says a significant, or I would note in particular Fowler's observation that in many ways religious institutions work best if they are people, with the majority of committed folk best described by stage 3. And he says a significant feature of stage 3, synthetic conventional faith, is the sense of security found in willing conformity. Religion, faith, and religious institutions are not synonymous with each other. What I found insightful there is he's saying, most of our religious institutions fall within these stages that Fowler is talking about, and as a whole, and that they work best in stage 3, where it's conventional faith, and they just kind of accept it, security in conformity, and that often when we move beyond that stage, these kind of dogmatic super churches and religious dogmatic movements in different ways fall apart because people are allowed to think what they want, describe themselves how they want, and find other avenues of expression, other faith walks, other communities, and then it becomes more diverse and pluralistic in a way that is hard to control in a very hierarchical way. And so often when our churches become more liberal in certain ways, especially when they're open to other faiths, you get this really great diversity, but also people excited about other different things, and maybe not coming to church every Sunday in the same way that we would like, and not all wearing the same clothes, calling themselves the same things. And I think that's healthy. I think that's really beautiful. I think it's beautiful that our interfaith community at large lends itself to people's creativity and not defining each other by projecting ourselves and then rejecting the part of them that is different. I think instead it's looking at the part of them that's different and trying to feed it and fan it. And maybe it's one of the reasons that Swedenborgianism as a whole isn't huge. I mean, Swedenborg used to be pretty popular in the US before the 19th century, 20th century. And Swedenborgianism was actually pretty popular in Africa, believe it or not. But as a whole, Swedenborgianism is interfaith. Swedenborg believed that you didn't have to be Christian to go to heaven, although he was very deeply Christian. He had a very high Christology and thought God is one person, not three persons in the Godhead. God is one person and entered the world as Christ. The soul of Christ was Jehovah. And then through Christ's life, Christ overcame unending or infinite temptation, and upon finishing that, upon overcoming all those temptations, glorified herself and became further at one with her divine essence. As it says in the Gospels, Jesus was not yet glorified, so the Holy Spirit was not yet come, or something like that. So for Swedenborg, that's not three people, that's one person, and God kind of went through this process, this process of emergence in Christ, and then once Christ was glorified through that process of his life, her life, God became infinitely connected and expressive of her human qualities, and the Holy Spirit, which for Swedenborg is just God with us when we can't see her, became more present even in our very corporeal or selfish or natural, very materialistic points of view. God became even closer to us in a way that she hadn't before, because she hadn't taken on a physical body in the way that we think of it. Although, as we're seeing in this book, God is present in all creation, and that emergent aspect may be described in Christ, may be described in others, is described in the whole universe as a process, and is also described in us. It's a deep idea from Swedenborgian perspectives and Swedenborg's idea, or Swedenborg's writings, that each of us is an image of that glorification process in our own regeneration process. And although we don't become glorified to infinity in this life, we don't start glowing like the sun as Christ did, and we don't resurrect after 3 days as Christ did, we are in that process thanks to Christ, thanks to God, thanks to Sophia, and we continue in that process in the next life, no matter our tradition, no matter what we call God. In fact, that emergent creativity that we're talking about here towards beautiful communities and higher levels of complexity and harmony is true in our own lives to eternity as well. And I think that's a beautiful concept, and I think it illuminates a lot of traditions. I don't think it's Swedenborgian Christianity is alone in saying that our process of evolution and growth is in this life and is to come as well. Let's see what you're saying in the chat, see. Alyssa says, one fun activity I did with my kids involved explaining how can build in us, causing an explosion by having my kids do a baking soda and vinegar experiment. They love the sciencey part, and it provided a visual for a feel. So that's, yeah, so it's interesting that I think you're saying like how different things can build in us and explode, and how we can get angry, and maybe visualizing it is helpful for a kid. And if that example works, if that's what you're saying, Alyssa, yeah, I'm curious how you translate something like that into modifying their behavior, maybe even just the insight of seeing what they're doing in a destructive way as this kind of visual destruction could be helpful, or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the explosion of joy, and seeing that could also be like, wow, like I could share this with others. Look how prevalent this is. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And then moving on in this book, we're on page 85. He says, I may have missed it, but I have not found Kaufman dealing more explicitly than this with the relationship between creativity and agency. For my part, I find it impossible to conceive of effective creativity apart from agency. Forgive the repetition, but such a conception points beyond my actual mental reach. And if I take seriously the finite nature of my own mind and the infinite nature of God, it always will. It demands that I think in meta terms. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful realization that our minds, our wisdom is finite. It may have great depths, but we all know how we can be really off sometimes, that we don't know everything. And divinity, if you believe in divinity, has a wisdom that is infinite. And our wisdom, no matter how much it grows, no matter how wide it gets, compared to divinity's wisdom, is relatively nothing. And so and it's also received from divinity, right? So humility in regards to our own wisdom, our own processes, our own incarnation is very much deserved. Because another way Swedenborg describes God is infinite incarnation in goodness and life and health and all those things. And so even our incarnation, even the way we act in our bodies, etc., are received from divinity, and to the extent they're good, to the extent they're beautiful, express divinity, point to divinity, or a metaphor for something higher. Even nature is that way as well. And so realizing that that's true for us and others not only brings us together, but also humbles ourselves to say, okay, it's not from me, so how can I serve this greater thing? And even if you don't believe in divinity as this very personal God that is paying attention to everything we do and cares about us tremendously and hopes the best for us, I think looking at the universe through the light of George Dole's book and others helps to illuminate, I think, something beautiful that it's going on no matter what your religious beliefs, and that this universe, for whatever reason, is this emergent, beatific creation that on levels beyond our imagining, on every level of physics and creation, is creating these higher dynamisms that work together for even higher ones that find their peace and joy in working together, and even higher ones. And although destruction is a process that's necessary, and freedom to be destructive is a process that's necessary, or at least a perspective that's necessary, all in all, it actually has built up to something amazing. And I think that could be true for our lives if we lean into that modality. And so in a way, we can all kind of get on the same page of okay, let's look at our motivations, let's look at how we work in community, and let's cultivate what the universe is showing us, which is this higher purpose, in a sense, at least this higher leaning, this arc of history towards justice, this beauty that always transcends the beauty before in these multi-levels of the world around us in the universe. So yeah, I think we're on the same page there, hopefully, which is a beautiful thing. Now, final chapter, Credo. Jumping to the bottom of page 87, if the fundamental direction of the fire, the phrase for God in this book often, is toward forming relationships and creating increasingly differentiated and harmonious aggregations, what we were just talking about, then it does seem appropriate to see ourselves as the leading edge of that story on this planet. I'd agree, I think, maybe. Only if we see ourselves in connection with the natural world around us, though, because we see how it goes otherwise, right? If this is indeed the case, he says, then a dispassionate look at the present state of the whole human race certainly suggests that there is no excuse for hubris. Wilson sees it as, or is it hubris? I don't know, someone tell me. Wilson sees it as risking self-destruction. Mitchell felt anguish over our condition and held that there is an immense amount of room for further progress. Thomas suspected that we might be, quote, only at the beginning of learning to use the system, with almost all our evolution as a species still ahead of us, unquote. I think it was the use of system in this sentence that Thomas, that's from Thomas, and these are all physicists that he's been talking about in earlier chapters, that kind of illuminated my mind and thinking, yeah, maybe our evolution is in, of course, this whole system and all these other ways of thinking about it, but also our political system, our economic system. Let's use these systems for these greater things. Let's, instead of them always using us and destroying our lives and forcing us into scarcity mindsets, because it's not just our mindset, it's really is a force, because there is scarcity, but the only reason there is scarcity, in a sense, is because we force it on each other. You put someone in a room and you don't give them water, they have scarce resources. It's true. They can pray to God, but they're probably not going to find a fountain underneath the ground. And I think that's what our society often does. We silo resources, even though there's infinite resources, really, there are more resources than we can handle. We actually throw a lot of it away, and we could be doing it better, right? But we force a lot of people into these basements and these hollows, these tough situations. I'm not talking about just metaphorically. We're also a society that has like the highest amount of serial killers and kidnappers and all these things in the Western world, at least. And I think there's a reason for it. I think it's like an image of the whole. We put people in holes and we murder them, we destroy their lives in all kinds of ways through the justice system, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, looking at these systems as leverage tools to heal each other and to make things easier for each other. And, I think it all comes back to this question of selfishness and institutional selfishness and us buying into other people's selfishness in the guise that they label it. And I think that's what we often do politically and economically. We say, well, it's, these CEOs deserve $20 million a year and yes, maximize shareholder profit, et cetera, in the business world, when in fact we're not maximizing worker profit. That's another type of capital, is worker capital, is each other's lives, and yet we value that very little. In fact, if you're maximizing your workers' pay, if you were maximizing the people around you's work and what they get out of it in today's free market capitalism, in the form we have it, not in every form, then you're actually breaking the bylaws of your company. You can be forced out by your shareholders often, unless you're a B corporation or not non-profit, etc. And that's our system. We made it that way. Even capitalism could be better. Our bylaws of publicly traded companies don't have to say these things. So enough of my rant on economics, but I think people have it really tough around us. So thinking about these things is super important. So further in this final chapter, he says, I find it fascinating to see biblical thought and scientific thought converging on this point, and that's that all these things are getting better, and actually there's something beautiful going on in creation. And so he was quoting physicists, now he quotes the Bible, Isaiah. For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. That's beautiful. I think Swedenborgians tend to read that very metaphorically. I know I do, that all the things in myself that used to be destructive, even kind of these domination-oriented impulses and strengths that I might have, will eventually become at peace with the greater calling of my spirit, and I'll find peace in this kingdom that is Cory, and also in the world around me to the extent I can, and these things will work to the greater good. I think that's part of the process, but I also think taking it pretty literally is actually very helpful and also noteworthy, that one day our world could be in this kind of peace where they shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says God in this quote. And I think that's beautiful. I mean, if you really think about it, let's say we were in an abundant society and we spent a lot more time in nature. We didn't have to work as hard to scrap by. We didn't need 3 jobs, etc., etc. Maybe we start, hanging out with the lions more. Maybe we come up with cool body armor. Who knows? Maybe we can do a lot of things that we never thought of doing, and that life is more prevalent because we're not destroying the environment around us. And so maybe one day the lion learns, well, if I try to eat the dog, the humans have something that stops me, and who knows? Like, maybe there is a future for us where even the most destructive elements in nature aren't as destructive. That's not to say lions should eat hay or whatever. I think forcing that on lions would be a little tough, but also mean. But you never know what's coming. We should lean into abundance and love and not destroying, and then we'll see how beautiful it can get. Further on the next page, if this has been going on for the whole history of the human race, the burden of proof should be on those who assume that it has now come to a halt. Talking about this process, Steven Pinker suggests that it has not. The evidence he presents is impressive, and it indicates that there has been a steady decrease in violence going on through much of recorded history. It is all too easy to look at the past through rose-colored glasses. Yeah, I think this is a good highlight from George Dole, a good description of how we often look at the past as better than it was. I'm sure you've heard of the golden years, but of course, golden years for who? Not only is it very select for the US often, but it's also very select population in the US. And so I think, and we had no idea how much rape and murder was happening back then. When we started keeping track of some of these things and people started speaking up, the numbers blossomed, and so I think it's amazing to think, oh well, the numbers blossomed here, so that's when it started. No, a lot of this stuff started before, and as we know through the minorities in this country, they were constantly harassed and brutalized, and none of that was recorded for the most part. And so I think, and of course we've seen even recently that the statistics have decreased even from the highs of the 80s, 90s, etc. And so I think there's a beautiful trend even in society, despite some of the macro problems that we're aware of, that lends itself to more health and beauty and community. And hopefully that continues and we don't turn on each other or destroy the world and each other in the process, right? There is no question that the great empires of the past were built by armed conquests, George says, with the vanquished often becoming the slaves of the victors. And if there were voices raised in moral outrage, they evidently did not get much of a hearing back then. In biblical times, every year plowshares might have been beaten into swords and pruning hooks into spears as soon as the fields were planted. And he references Joel from the Hebrew scriptures, only to be beaten back by the survivors at the end of the war season. And he references Isaiah and Micah. So a lot of war, and again, that's the world wars are of the past, hopefully. And he says, as a pastor, I would insist that we not sanitize the biblical narrative. Good point. But instead take its candor with full seriousness, with both grief and gratitude. Our models of the past are in black and white, based on detached observations from a painless distance. The models of the present are in full color, based on far more intimate involvement. So I think that's his effort of describing how often we can look at the past in rose-colored glasses and also miss a lot of what was going on and how horrific it was and just see the horror today. Of course, many people want to ignore some of the horrors today, so that view can only go so far, right? We have to be, just like with ourselves, willing to be critical and interrogate what's really going on and try to improve it for the better. Further down, he says, I am quite unwilling to believe that the fire that has been impelling the unfolding of the universe for the past 14 billion years has suddenly decided to quit. Perhaps we are faced with great problems simply because we are so senselessly resistant to the great solutions of cooperation among religious faiths, ideologies, and nations. Later he says, this surely says that the whole notion of the conquest of earth is a death trap. Talking about this domination-mindedness that leads to, a lot of the destructive habits that we have in business and otherwise. For readers who want predictions, here's a candidate. If we keep trying to conquer the earth rather than to cooperate with it, we will lose not may or might or probably or even almost certainly just plain unvarnished will. So we'll lose. Ecology will be destroyed. He says, still, a divine creativity continues to press both us and the universe toward clearer differentiation and more intimate integration. And in comparison with the proven power and persistence of that 14 billion year record of achievement, our scientific successes are momentary and, frankly, trivial. What we do know is ever more obviously dwarfed by what we realize we don't know. Kind of that you put our knowledge over God, it's nothing. Thing we talked about earlier. Yeah, we don't know hardly anything. And I guess you don't have to have God in that equation if you don't believe in God. It's just recognizing our vast ignorance. But there is obvious reason for alarm, and the alarms are getting louder. And he says he hopes we're on the verge of waking up, that we're not going to be as arrogant and self-destructive as we used to be. And he believes we won't because he believes in real divinity, he says, and that there's a real pressure towards this growth and this arc of history towards justice. And he says, although God may play with dice, they're loaded for goodness and all these beautiful things in mind, and that will win out on this planet as well. Hopefully. That would be very nice, George. And then heading towards the end here, he says the fullest realization of the goal that I can model is that of a global community in which all the unique gifts of and within distinct nations, communities, and individuals are clearly identified. So all the gifts are identified, constructively interrelated, and universally treasured. So we start caring about what other people bring to the table. That's great. This might be the fullest possible expression of creativity itself, and while it seems far from realization at the moment, as globalism gains strength, it begins to become imaginable and even conceivable, at least on sunny days. Yeah, I think there is a breaking of barriers slowly, even from our American-centric, U.S.-centric mindset here in the States where I am right now. And I see it in weird places, even like if you go to Netflix, there's a lot more global shows about other cultures, and I think that's beautiful. You can learn a lot more about Mexico. You can watch their new show about fighting. I think it's called Fight World. Every episode's a new country, and it's not really fights. It's actually about the cultures around it and in it, and it becomes really a beautiful thing because you see these kind of transcending of boundaries of values and breaking these barriers and uplifting the community and love and all these cultures that often in the U.S. at least we take for granted and don't know anything about. And I think just learning about each other is probably the biggest thing when it comes to coming together and healing and accepting our shared joy and the joy that we should share for each other and our growth and love. And so he says, when Swedenborg defined love as, quote, feeling the joy of someone else's joy within ourselves, unquote, he was identifying very precisely a level of being in touch with reality that I believe is a distinct improvement for humanity. Yeah, feeling the joy of someone else's joy within yourself, that's something for each of us to lean into, I think. He says that in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life, and is in fact crucial to our survival, he was setting a clear target for a desperately needed transformation of consciousness. And then to summarize the book, he says, I am offering a model in which emergence is seen as the recursive fractal effect of a dialogue between differentiating and integrating. This dialogue has its root in the essential nature of reality. It has been going on since the Big Bang and has now reached the formidable complexity of a wide variety of unique human individuals and conscious community. Wonderful. As I think that phrase, that summary is like a fractal within each of these chapters. He wasn't very shy about the point of the book, although it took me a couple chapters to really feel like I knew what he was trying to say, I think. And then he says further down, this radically idealized is probably the clearest image we can form of the ultimate reality process, the S existere, which he earlier defined as to be is to become or to emerge, to be becoming. The concept of an omnipresent, omniscient, and eternally creative meta-personal deity. This 14 billion year event, this reality and process is truly awesome. And if we fail to see the extent of our knowledge in the vastly greater context of our ignorance, what we do claim to know is sadly distorted. I think that's also why it's good to share your context with people. For example, I, as many people would put, I'm a cis male, born and raised in Missouri. I grew up with a lot of religions in my life, and I found Swedenborgianism in my mid-20s, and I feel called to uplift your and others' spiritual health wherever you are, even if you're not Swedenborgian. That's my context to a small degree. Please share yours on the website or in our chat see. We want to get to know each other here. And he says, resistance to the restless creative motion of life itself sounds to me like a shortcut to death. I should also say I'm biracial, and I identify a lot with the LGBTQ community, not directly per se, but in the fact that they're humans, and I feel a deep affection for people who are oppressed and ostracized. And I also think these barriers we put up with each other are only barriers in our hearts for our own joy. And so having some patience with each other, being willing to say we don't always have it right and to try to do it better is actually a beautiful thing. Another 2 cents from me. And then the last paragraph of this chapter. This model is offered as urging us toward the transformation of consciousness that Edgar D. Mitchell saw as necessary for coping with the ever-increasing planetary crises besetting civilization. What it lacks, at least as I have presented it, is the power to evoke the sense of awe that was at the core of both Mitchell's experience in space and Einstein's understanding of a supreme intelligence. I believe that religion's greatest gift, if we are willing to accept it, is the gift of awesome beauty, a beauty of holiness. Quoting Psalm, that is essential to any realistic sense of how, why, and whither we and the universe are emerging. Truly, es enim per existere est. Well, thank you, George Dole, for the last minute plug in for religion. That there's, I think that begs the question: what is religion, and why does he say it's necessary at the end? He's saying there's beauty in religion and holiness, and I think maybe looking at the universe and realizing that there's a personal quality to it, and this emergent reality, this consciousness, lends itself to beauty because we're more willing to see it as a whole. Maybe that's why, even for us non-theists out there, we rephrase things as, well, the universe seems to be indicating this or that, and others say that as well. And I think that's because there's a deep transcendent quality when we start to see these connections. And there's a high level of correlation between the universe and the human mind, according to a supercomputer study from San Diego, as I mentioned in an earlier video. And I think that's kind of amazing that consciousness seems to be running in a way on the macro level of the universe. And so whether or not you want to call that an image of God in the macro or not, I think just accepting that that's the case can maybe lend itself to seeing this deeper calling for our universe, at least. So you may say, well, our universe is a rare one, so, and maybe one of many or something, and so God doesn't necessarily exist. Well, if we know our universe exists in this way and works in this way, and lends itself on every level, from the smallest to the biggest, in this way, well, wouldn't we want to lean into that and leverage it for the beautiful livelihood and connection and community that it seems to create? I think so. I think that's a calling for all of us, no matter our beliefs. And then he has an appendix on, like, putting this in Swedenborgian terms. I think it's beautiful that he's like, okay, well, I'm going to talk pure Swedenborgianism. He does it very succinctly in the appendix. I'm curious what you all think. And turning towards our Chatsy, Albert says, when we know how to raise our minds above images of thought derived from space and time, we pass from darkness into light and taste things spiritual and divine. Nice idea. That's from Swedenborg. Yeah, I wonder what that means to think beyond space and time. In a way, like, it has to be affectional qualities to some degree, maybe. Has to be metaphorical in a sense, although often stories have elements of space and time. But a lot of times when Swedenborg talks about thinking beyond space and time, he still talks about processes. And he relates space in the spiritual world to difference in state. So if you have a difference in internal state from someone else, or even hate them, you're further away from them. He talks about time as changes of state, and in a sense that's true in the physical realm. The only thing that defines time in the physical realm is that these processes continue on, all these levels, and then we can measure it, and there's a cascading movement. And so in a way, but it's very clockwork in a sense. We can measure the speed of light here, although that changes from your point of view and where you're looking, interestingly enough, according to Einstein. But I think it's kind of amazing that, in a way, Swedenborg's describing our reality when he talks about spiritual reality having these dynamisms. But he also says difference in space relates to quality. Even though you can see someone who's very different from you, you couldn't get very close to them unless you both really wanted to, I guess. He also talks about how, if you think of someone in the next life, they appear to you. It's almost like, 300 years ago, he was talking about FaceTime. And you could talk to each other. And it also relates to near-death experiences where people see their relatives right after they die. They just appear to them, often looking more beautiful and younger than they did in this world, interestingly enough. And it's funny because Swedenborg describes that too in this kind of metaphysical, this quantum-like realm where closeness, I'm talking in metaphors, closeness of heart brings closeness in spirit and visualization and bodies in the next life. Because he does talk about bodies, and even those change with your internal state in the next life. So in a way, it's like a, a spiritual reality that has more to do with quantum physics and affectional things than it does anything else, as you might expect. And I think that's kind of amazing because, according to him, that's what gave forth to quantum physics and these things. And so the fact that we can maybe see its roots, their roots of these laws and these ideas in the spiritual realm, at least of a writer 300 years ago, whether or not we believe it, it's kind of amazing that that's possible. And I think it gives even more cohesiveness to this universe and how things seem to work, and maybe a little bit more insight into some of the trippier things in our reality. And in fact, reality itself is quite amazing, as any physicist will tell you. So thank you for joining us in our last discussion on the universe and I feel like it was a fractal experience. He hit on new concepts every chapter, but he also covered other ones. Interestingly enough, I think it was digestible in a way that I was not expecting. I think it speaks to us whether or not we're theists, or I think it has a certain level of insight and beauty to it, even if we don't agree with everything George Dole said, in a way that illuminates a lot of physics and physicists, the way they think. I think if I read Hawking, I'll be more prone to seeing some of the deeper things he's saying and not thinking, well, this is pure science, because in fact nothing quite is, right? It's all model-dependent realism, hopefully. Hopefully we're checking our models and leaning into the realism around us and the reality around us, and not shying away from some deeper questions and some deeper answers just because we believe a certain way. Because in fact, often from a scientific base view, we say, well, I don't believe that because I believe in science. But doesn't that kind of reject the idea of science if you say that? Science lends itself to learning what's real and accepting it as the evidence shows up, not deciding something's real and then saying that that's always true because I believe in science. I mean, you could say I try to lean into realism in my models because I believe in science, and yet that's still try, because we all tend to come up with reasons why we're right, even in the face of our illogic, and we can reject other people for it. We can argue with our spouse, our friends, our neighbors for it, and not really see the deep beauty and emergent quality around us that we should accept as being from the greater universe and something to lean into and love deeply. So thanks again, everyone. I'll continue to chat with you all in the chat for a few minutes, and I think next week we'll be talking straight from Swedenborg, one way or another, so tune in. We'll have other services and interviews for you as well. Thanks for joining the Swedenborgian interfaith community today. Go forth knowing that you are quite loved.